Our yields were 1,000 to 2,000 pounds the acre. 2,000 pounds the acre was a big crop. 2 years ago, I was in one blueberry field that produced 15,000 pounds to the acre.
It comes down to generating new knowledge that we didn't know before, and then having that then translate into new technologies.
Welcome to Beyond Research. I'm your host, Stephanie Reed. Today's episode might seem like a story about boosting blueberry production, but there's more beneath the surface. It's a tale of how local research can shape not only an industry, but an entire sector. Joining us are Dr. David Percival and blueberry veteran Gary Brown. Through a story about blueberries, we'll explore how this research isn't just about more blueberries in the box. It's about influencing agriculture on a broader scale, both locally and internationally. This work is addressing challenges facing all agriculture crops, like disease, pests, and climate change. Stay tuned to discover the intricate connection between research, agriculture, and the broader public good.
So we're sitting in the Wild Blueberry Research Center in Debert, Nova Scotia, and it provides us with a base or a place where we can do these research trials on wild blueberries. The research trials themselves, they're so important for the industry because the industry is only located in the Maritime provinces, Quebec, as well as Maine. And as a result of this, if a problem arises, we can't draw on technologies from California, from Europe. The solutions have to be found here.
Dr. David Percival is a professor at Dalhousie Agricultural Campus in the Department of Plant, Food, and Environmental Sciences. Over the past 24 years, Dr. Percival has worked closely with the farming community to increase the fundamental knowledge of wild blueberry plant biology, soil fertility, plant nutrition, and disease management.
I had my education at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College. I worked 19 years there as a berry crop technician, and I worked 25 years in the wild blueberry industry, and I'm now retired.
Gary Brown has worked in the blueberry sector for more than 40 years. Although technically retired, Gary is so passionate about wild blueberries, he has remained involved and continues to work closely with Millen Farms, a family-owned sustainable berry farm with over 185 acres of strawberry and over 600 acres of wild blueberry.
The disease problems in particular, and didn't appreciate them at the time, but by the 1st September, all of our leaves had dropped, and on our sprout fields, and so we're ready for next year, and everybody accepted that. That was normal until David proved to us that those leaves were dropping because of disease.
And when in 1996, I can't imagine there was a huge reliance on research, or it wasn't regarded probably how it is today. Like, was there reluctance from the growers at the time?
Our biggest frustrations at that time, we couldn't find anybody to look at our problems. So we sat down as a grower group and said, we have to have somebody dedicated to low-bush blueberries, because the only research we could get done were people that had other responsibilities as well, be it strawberries, grapes, raspberries, or whatever. So we didn't have anybody dedicated to the low bush blueberry industry, and that's when the decision was made, we have to hire somebody. So we started basically looking. I have to tell a cute anecdote in all of this is that Dr. Percival applied for the position, came and made a presentation on some of his research trials. It was right in May, and it was right in bloom time. The blueberry industry uses a lot of bees for pollination. I was involved in pollination. I'd been up all night. I sat in the lecture theater and listened to them, and it was a nice, dark, quiet place, and I started to doze off. David noticed that.
So it's quite the first impression.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Yeah, David could certainly think he hasn't got any interest in what I'm talking about. And I was just sleepy.
Oh, well, and now look at you both.
That's right.
Look at how far you've come.
Because the next week I arrived in his office with the problem and said, here, David, we got to get this solved.
And did he solve it?
Oh, yes.
Of course he did.
Well, it was one of our disease problems. We had, why is this happening? And that's when David started when Dr. Percival came on staff, we were struggling. There's no doubt about it, because we didn't have answers for a lot of our problems.
How would you describe the state of the blueberry industry in Nova Scotia on the day you arrived at the center?
Going back to June 1996, when I started work here, the industry has really changed. And when you look at it, total production of blueberries at that time, cultivated and wild, was approximately 660 million pounds. That year, the wild blueberry crop was quite low. I think it was in the vicinity of 124 million pounds that was produced. When you look at the industry at the time, it was an industry that still had a lot of smaller growers. So there's approximately 1,100 blueberry producers at the time that were trying to manage fields that had been in the families for, in some cases, many generations.
And the first thing we had to find was we didn't even know the diseases that were causing the problems. And
right.
David identified them, saw their life cycle, and knew when do we have to address these, at what time, with what product, and how time sensitive is that? How many days have we got to control this? All of that stuff.
So basically, in the early 90s, when yields were low or when the leaves were falling off, as you described, most growers just chalked it up to that's just the way it is.
That's the way it is. That is just the way that nature gave it to us. And I got to give David a lot of credit of that. That's the first thing he started looking at was, and as he mentioned earlier, what diseases are out there and what are they doing to us? And I mean, you even went to England and looked at Septoria and its life cycle and determined whether it was the same species that was affecting our blueberries, that was affecting, say, the cereal crops. He started, looking at all of that. And how do we control that species that's affecting the blueberry crop versus the cereal crop? So that's where all of this started, and it has just progressed over the last 27 years.
So before David came, before we knew to treat, plants a certain way after the harvest, it was really just kind of, well, let's hope for a better year next year. Let's just maybe it was just a one-off.
I'll be honest with you that it was a simple life back then. We prune now by mowing blueberry fields. In those days, we pruned by spreading straw and setting fires to burn these plants off, because the old plants have to be burnt off to allow new vegetative buds to come up next spring out of the ground.
When you first got here, just because I'm curious now, and you saw kind of how it was and what most producers were doing, both with, the burning and the, diseases and the crossing of the fingers, what were the most surprising things to you that you didn't think you were going to encounter?
Having gone through and been raised in a farming background, you tend to see quite a bit of things. So nothing really surprised me, and especially when you look at some of the challenges, whether it be watching a vineyard go down with gray mold, or apples. Well, scab is a perpetual problem for apple growers. I just looked at it as, okay, well, we know there's limiting factors there. Now let's get our head around what they are, when they're a problem, okay, and what are the tools in the toolbox that we can hopefully develop to address them.
And what have the results looked like since the research program was put in place?
Well, there was already, when you look at the body of knowledge that was out there, there was definitely a good group of researchers that were here before me, but the challenges changed. And over time, we really tried to address trying to obtain a better knowledge of how the plant grows, how it develops, and then also some of the stresses that have come along. And in particular, in my case, I've ended up focusing quite a bit of my attention on the disease management side of things over the past 20 years. And so the implications of this are when we started doing this work back in the early 2000s, what was happening is the diseases would come in, they'd affect the canopy, the leaves would prematurely fall off. There just wasn't enough resources there for the floral buds to develop in the first year, the vegetative year. And as a result of this, in the crop year, the crop's harvestable berry yields were really quite low. And as a result of this, we had to find out, okay, well, what's the organism that's causing this? How do you control it? And then what are the net effects? So Overall, as far as yields are concerned, they've gone from approximately 1,000 to 2,000 pounds per acre to good fields now. I think we're in the vicinity of 8,000 pounds plus an acre, with some, I think, Gary can back this up, being well over 12,000 pounds an acre.
So that's more berries in the box.
Definitely more berries in the box, yeah.
And that was one of the goals, is to identify those threats and how can we produce as Nova Scotia more berries.
David has been proactive instead of reactive. He and I will sit down and look at what the problems are, what we think the problems are going to be, and what research we need to address those problems in the future. And that has really paid off for us big time for the whole industry. The growers rely so much on David's information. He holds information meetings during the winter months where the growers will sit down and everybody's got a pad and a pen and they're taking down his information to apply it to their own farm.
That's incredible. And you were talking earlier when we were chatting outside by the field, you were chatting about just how many of those berries leave the province now. Can you talk a little bit about?
On an average, 90% of Nova Scotia's blueberry crop is exported. That's hard to believe, but we are normally in excess of 300 million pounds, and that would be the state of Maine, the Maritime provinces, and the province of Quebec as far as the wild industry. So we have to find a home for all of those. The biggest home right now is Europe, and luckily the second biggest home is Japan.
And going back to some of the problems that growers are facing right now out in the fields, obviously there are some that you're investigating right now with some of the blueberry crops outside. Can you tell us a bit about the ones that are high on the list right now for research trials?
Okay, well, the two main ones, the weed issues that we're running into are definitely posing a challenge. And some of that is just due to there are very few control products, especially with respect to weed management that can be used. And the ones that we have been using, there's some weed resistance arising with them. And then there's quite a few new weed species. So there's a team of researchers now that are addressing these pest management issues, working at the Dehazy Agricultural Campus. And so Scott White in particular, he's putting quite a bit of effort into identifying, okay, well, what are they? And then hopefully the technologies on how to address them will then come from it. On the disease management side, really it's broken itself down into two main ones. So as we talked about earlier, in the vegetative year, it's the leaf spot diseases that really became quite an issue. And in particular, we have two. We have one that starts a little bit earlier. So it's a bit of a complex of an organism we haven't really seen much before. So spherulina is what it's referred to. There's also others in there as well. And so it infects the leaf. It causes the leaf to be not as effective at serving as a solar panel to intercept that incoming light energy and turn it into chemical energy the plant can use. So we had that problem early on. And then there's one that's a bit of an invasive pest into the area on the disease side, which is blueberry rust. And what makes it rust.
You don't hear about rusty blueberries
no,
often.
You don't.
No,
you don't. But again, it's one that affects mostly the leaves. But the problem with it is it has alternate hosts. And so in Nova Scotia, a lot of our blueberry fields are located in remote areas, surrounded by woodlots. You have an abundance of hemlock situated within them. Well, unfortunately, the hemlock's the alternate host. And so it can bounce from the blueberries to the hemlock and then back into the blueberry field. And it's quite damaging. Like it'll really defoliate the blueberries quite effectively as we go into the late summer and into the fall months.
For those who may not be out in the farms or the fields, rather, like you are each and every day, people would mainly think of weeds as pests. And yes, we all know weeds, but those are some pretty significant weeds we were looking at out there. And what are the effects on the harvesting process with weeds like that?
Well, it's interesting. I pointed out this morning, there's a grass we call fescue that wet conditions, especially like we have in harvest this year, it winds up in the harvester heads. It strips berries off that it don't end up in the box. They end up on the ground. And to go back to what Dr. Purcell said about Dr. White and some of the research trials he'd done, I've been in this industry a long while, and I worked with a researcher at a Kinfo by the name of Dr. Claus Jensen, who is now retired. And I still remember, and it's very vivid in my mind, he and I were looking at this grass in Pars Pro, and the normal farming methods, what's controlling it? What is the issue? Why are we not controlling this grass? So Dr. Jensen took samples, and on his way home, he stopped along the roadside and got the same grass and took samples off of it and got the seeds out of it, grew them in the greenhouse in the Kentville Research Station, and then treated them like they would be normally treated in a blueberry field. And the grass along the roadside was dead instantly. The grass in the blueberry fields never died. So that meant we had to look at alternative methods. We had to look at new research trials.
Right. And what are some of those other technologies that you've developed outside of the pesticides that can be used?
When you look at some of the tools that we're seeing at the source, for example, the UAVs and these sorts of things, they have a pretty important application now for us as an industry. And so it's provided us with the opportunity to map our fields and say, okay, well, how many blueberries are present? Where are they located? And so this allows us then to be far more precise with respect to the inputs that we're using. It allows us to see, okay, are there some weed issues in the field that are a little bit more of a problem than what we thought initially? And down the road, we hear about these systems being used for the delivery of parcels through Amazon and things like this. Well, we think we can also use them in the management of the fields as well. So be very specific and localized, because at the end of the day, we pride ourselves as having a very sustainable production system. So we're far more sustainable than most other berry crops for sure, as well as other fruit crops. And so with the global market of blueberries just increasing exponentially, it allows us to continue to differentiate ourselves and then also keep the cost of production down to allow the growers to remain competitive.
Very cool. And it just seems that there's no shortage of new problems that are arising for the industry, blueberries specifically. And can you tell us just some of the impacts we've seen even in the last year due to climate change here in Nova Scotia? Can you just talk a little bit about the impacts of those things on the crops?
Okay. So the stresses over the past year have been phenomenal when you look at it, starting off with the hurricane last year. And it was one just with that full day of incredibly high winds. It just whipped these stems around that were in the process of trying to form floral buds. And so that was a challenge in itself. And so our floral bud numbers are down a little bit compared to prior years. And then we went into winter. And at the end of January, early February, we ended up with minus 30 degrees centigrade temperatures, which caused a little bit of winter injury. It caused a lot more damage to the grape, the wine grape sector and the tender tree fruit, also in the province. But it also, it pushed us back a little bit. And then we get into the spring where we had incredibly dry conditions. And I've never seen fields at the early stages of the growing season where the soil was just almost like powder. It was so dry. And then we go to the other end of the spectrum where just an abundance of rainfall. And what that's posing now is issues on the disease side. So we're really starting to see when you pull away the blueberry canopy, because of these wet conditions, the interior is getting a little bit moldy. The abundance of the rainfall is also starting to split some of the berries, so we're going to be starting to see more and more spoilage as a result of these split berries. And so this is where the technologies we've been working on play a pretty important role, because some of the treatments that we've been using this year, the canopy is still healthy. And so that's a big factor in allowing these blueberry producers to remain competitive.
That's great to hear that the crops are still going strong, but I'm guessing that some of these climate events, as we call them, will help inform future trials here at the center.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And especially when you look at, for example, with some of the disease issues that we've been seeing, it's okay, how can you keep these disease pressures down and provide a grower with the tools to allow them to remain competitive in a global economy?
Right. So from the grower's perspective, from Nova Scotian perspective, like how is the work here, or how do you see the work here impacting our agriculture and our economy as a whole long term? And how critical is the ongoing research?
I don't have the figures in front of me to say how valuable the blueberry industry is to the province, but it's huge because it spills over into everything else.
What have you learned from your work here at the center that has then been applied to other crops or industries?
When you look at some of the disease issues that we have present in the blueberry fields, a lot of them apply to the other fruit crop sectors. So, for example, it doesn't matter if it's a strawberry, a blueberry, or a grape. Gray mold, which is caused by the fungal pathogen Botrytis cinerea, is definitely the culprit of interest. And so when you then look at, okay, well, how can we better manage this disease and control it? It's something that once we had a good insight into some of the things that worked, it transfers quite readily to then the other sectors.
And how is that information shared here in Nova Scotia amongst the other sectors? Or is it up to the other sectors to kind of hear what you're doing here?
It's very much, it really starts within the industry. And so, as a researcher and especially working at a university, you tend to initially focus on, okay, well, what's that publication I'm going to get? But it's more than that. It's the importance of getting the message out to producers and then also to the extension specialists working in the region about these new technologies and their potential fit. And then so once you take that first step in getting out the message out to the blueberry growers, then the feeder lines all of a sudden start to become quite active. And so then tools, whether it be to the high bush blueberry sector in the valley or strawberry or grape sector, it generally moves along quite quickly after that.
So do you know if many of your technologies have been picked up by other sectors?
Oh, definitely, especially in the high bush sector, which is amazing that we're given such a small portion of it now compared to what's occurring globally. But some of these technologies are definitely making their way into the larger audience.
And clearly your research is having an impact beyond our borders here in Nova Scotia. You had mentioned a partnership with Norway or a collaboration with Norway. Can you talk a little bit about any international work you have been doing?
Sure. And I'll go over a few little things along with that. So as a result of this job and the research projects that are supported by the producers and by the Bragg group of food companies, it has allowed us to collaborate with other universities. So the one in Norway is the Arctic University of Norway, and they have an excellent molecular biologist group there. And so it became really important for us because at the Truro Agricultural Campus, we had a little bit of a roof fire at the Research Institute where I worked. And so we were out of commission, and there was just, how are we going to allow these students to continue work? And so the PhD student at the time, Joel Abbey, he went to Norway, and he was able to learn these techniques, and everything came together for him. So he really did a nice job on his project as a result of it. Another example of being involved in collaborative activities on a global basis has been, we have an international blueberry meeting happening here next year. So it's International Vaccinium Symposium. And as a result of being involved in the industry and in the research community for 27 years now, it's provided a lot of opportunities. And so I'm actually chair of the working group of what we call the Vaccinium Working Group. And so it allows you to gain insight into what's going on in every area where blueberries are being produced. And again, going back, that would not have been possible without the solid support that we've had here, both on the producers as well as in the industry sector as well.
And so last question I have is, what are your hopes for the wild blueberry industry here in Nova Scotia? Where would you love to see us be in 5, 10, 20 years' time in terms of new technology, berry yields, you name it?
So I believe that for the wild blueberry industry to remain competitive in a global economy where so many different countries are now producing fruit, being able to show and illustrate that we have the most sustainable production system is going to be absolutely essential. And so that's an area that is definitely going to be my focus, and I hope will continue to be a focus. After I finish my career up, as well as what can be done to try to keep the industry here as competitive as possible. Because when you look in particular at the rural areas, whether it be of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or Prince Edward Island, the opportunities just aren't as apparent as what you would have in downtown Halifax or in other agronomic areas, like in the prairies. Just the scale is just not there. So, but it's nonetheless incredibly important to try to keep these areas of the Nova Scotia economy viable.
Right. Wonderful. Gary, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that because I want to look at it from the grower point of view. We know what our input costs are. We're relying on David's research. I'll be very plain about this, but we're relying on David's research to give us as many pounds per acre as we possibly can because we're paid by the pound. So if our yield per acre goes down, our input costs are still up there, the profit margin certainly deteriorates for the grower. So maintaining these disease problems, in particular, is what David's work is. And we never even mentioned the fact that David has done quite a bit of work on fertility research as well. And that comes with a whole slate of problems on its own, because fertility has worked really well for growing a better plant, growing that solar panel better. But the weeds like fertility as well.
Right. Weeds love everything.
Yeah. So, we're making our own problems there, and we got to kind of solve it all. But in the last day of the week, the grower wants as many pounds per acre as he can get for the least input cost as possible, because that's where his money is. We have to depend on world prices, and the only time that the grower really makes big money is his input costs are down, his yields are up, and that's where his profit margin starts to really appear. This year, we don't know what the price is going to be, so the highest yields possible is where the grower is going to get the money.
As we've heard, this wild blueberry research isn't just about yields. It's about cultivating a sustainable future for agriculture. Dr. David Percival's work exemplifies how specific research can have universal application, transcending borders and benefiting entire sectors. The next time you enjoy those juicy blueberries, remember that the story behind them reaches far beyond the fields. Thank you for joining us on Beyond Research. Until next time, stay curious. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and leave us 5 stars. You can also follow us on social at Beyond Research Podcast and let us know what research topics you would like to hear on the podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.